Why do you feel like you are falling behind, even when nothing is clearly wrong? That question does not demand an answer right now. It only asks to be held for a moment. Let it rest in the room with you. Because it is a strange feeling, this one. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with the force of grief, or the clarity of disappointment, or the weight of something you can point to and name. It comes more quietly than that. It comes in moments like this one, when the day has finished, when the noise has settled, when there is nothing left to do, and the mind, no longer occupied, turns back toward itself and finds something waiting there, something not quite worry, not quite sadness, not quite regret, but something in the vicinity of all three. There is no urgency in naming it this way. There is only recognition. Søren Kierkegaard wrote in 19th century Denmark about the particular weight that comes with being free. He was concerned with what it means to be a self, to make genuine choices, to live a life that is not fixed, but genuinely open. And one of the things he noticed with great precision is that freedom carries a kind of vertigo. When you are genuinely free, when your life could genuinely have gone differently, you carry with you all the lives that it could have been, the unchosen paths, the versions of yourself that were possible and did not become actual. And that awareness, the awareness of all those alternative selves standing quietly alongside the one you actually are, produces a feeling that is not quite regret and not quite grief, but has something of both. The feeling of being behind, Kierkegaard might say, has something to do with the weight of your own possibility. Friedrich Nietzsche asked a different kind of question, and asked it differently, with more edge, with more force. He was interested in where values come from, who sets the standards by which a life is judged, and what happens when you spend your life being measured against a standard you never actually chose. His concern was not with weakness or failure, but with the quieter problem of living inside someone else's framework without knowing it. The sense of being behind depends on a standard, a benchmark, a picture of where a life like yours ought to be. And Nietzsche would ask, with characteristic directness, whose picture is that? Who decided what the arrival looks like? And have you ever actually agreed to it? Or has it simply been running in the background of your self-assessment, quietly issuing verdicts, without ever being invited in? And then there is Seneca, a Roman Stoic of the 1st century, a man who lived inside one of the most demanding political environments in Western history, and who wrote about time with a particular kind of care. His concern was with the way that human beings tend to misunderstand what they are doing with their lives, not because they are lazy or careless, but because of a structural habit of attention in which the present is always treated as a passage toward somewhere else, always the corridor rather than the room. The feeling of being behind, in Seneca's terms, is partly the consequence of living in a future that has not yet arrived, while the life you are actually living passes by almost unnoticed. He was not arguing for passivity. He was arguing for attention, for the recognition that the life being measured and assessed and found lacking is, in fact, the only life there is. These 4 minds will accompany us through the evening, not as lectures, not as answers, but as lenses. Each one offers a slightly different angle on the same feeling, a slightly different way of seeing what the feeling actually is and where it is actually coming from. And the value of multiple lenses is not that one of them will finally provide the correct view. It is that the act of looking through several of them, one after another, slowly in the quiet, begins to change the relationship between you and the feeling. Not by making it disappear, but by making it less opaque, by moving it from something that simply happens to you, something that arrives and sits on your chest and delivers its quiet verdict, to something more like an object of inquiry, something that can be examined rather than only endured. That shift from enduring to examining is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It happens slowly, in the way that understanding usually happens, by accumulation rather than revelation. But it is real, and it is available tonight, in the quiet, in the time between wakefulness and sleep, in the particular openness that comes with lying still, and letting the mind do what minds do, when they are neither distracted nor demanded of. The feeling of being behind has been with you for a while, perhaps for years. Perhaps it has been present in different forms at different periods of your life, wearing different content, pointing at different gaps, but carrying the same essential quality. The sense of distance, of not yet, of slight misalignment with a life that was supposed to be different from this one. Tonight, it is worth understanding where that feeling lives. Not in the world, not in the objective facts of your circumstances, not in the comparative position of your achievements relative to those of others, but somewhere closer, somewhere in the structure of the mind itself, in the particular way that human consciousness relates to time and desire and possibility and value. Understanding that does not make the feeling less real, but it changes what the feeling means. And changing what something means is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a very good place to begin. There is a philosopher who wrote in the 19th century about the nature of desire. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer, and his vision of human life was not a comforting one. He did not write to encourage. He wrote to observe, with a kind of unflinching honesty, the structure of the way humans experience wanting and having and wanting again. He was not a gentle thinker, but he was, in many respects, a precise one. And some of what he described about the mechanics of desire maps almost exactly onto this feeling of being behind. His central observation was something like this: the human will, by its nature, is always oriented toward something it does not yet have. Desire, in Schopenhauer's understanding, is not a temporary state that arrives and then resolves. It is more fundamental than that. It is the default condition of conscious life. The mind, when left to itself, reaches forward. It identifies something it wants, something it lacks, and it orients itself toward that lack. It strains toward the object of desire. And then, when that object is obtained, something interesting happens. The desire does not disappear. It moves. It locates itself in the next thing and the next lack, and the mind tilts toward that new horizon almost before the previous one has settled. There is a brief interval, Schopenhauer noted, between achieving what you wanted and wanting the next thing. A brief interval of satisfaction, of rest. But it is brief. And then the forward lean resumes. He described life, somewhat bleakly, as a pendulum swinging between desire and boredom. When you want something and do not have it, you suffer the ache of wanting. When you have it, you rest for a moment, and then either desire something else or feel the flat, grey weight of nothing to reach for. The mind, in his view, is almost never simply content. It is structured to move forward, always toward what is not yet here. Now, this description can feel a little severe. Schopenhauer had a famously dim view of human happiness, and it would be wrong to take his framework as the final word on human experience. But there is something in this observation, stripped of its pessimism, that speaks directly to the feeling you are sitting with tonight. Consider the feeling of being behind through this lens. The feeling depends entirely on comparison. You are not behind in some absolute sense. You are behind relative to something, a standard, an expectation, a version of what you imagined life would look like by now. Without that comparison point, the feeling cannot exist. And what is that comparison point? Where does it come from? In many cases, it comes from a future that the mind has constructed, a version of where you should be, what you should have achieved, who you should have become. The mind reaches ahead and builds this imagined destination, and then turns back and measures the distance between that destination and where you actually are. And the distance generates the feeling. But here is what Schopenhauer's framework allows you to notice. The destination is always moving. When you were 20, the destination looked like something specific. Perhaps it was a certain kind of work, or a relationship, or a particular sense of having figured out the central questions of your life. And then some of those things arrived, or something close to them arrived, and the destination moved. The horizon shifted. New markers appeared. The sense of where you should be recalibrated itself to a new position, always just a little further ahead than where you actually are. This is not a failure of ambition, or ingratitude, or lack of commitment. It is something closer to the structure of the mind itself. The mind does not naturally come to rest and say, "This is enough. I have arrived. No further reaching is required." It continues to reach. The comparison point continues to move. And so the feeling of being behind is not really a report on your progress. It is a report on the structure of the mind's relationship to progress. It is almost built in. Think about moments in your own life when you have achieved something you had been working toward for a long time. Something you genuinely wanted. Something you sacrificed for, or waited for, or worked steadily toward across months or years. When it arrived, there was something real in that. A satisfaction, perhaps. Relief. A feeling of completion. But how long did that feeling last before the mind began, quietly, to reorganize? Before the next thing began to take shape on the horizon? Before the standard reset itself and the feeling of distance returned? Most people, if they are honest, will notice that this interval is shorter than they expected. The arrival rarely feels as conclusive as the imagining of it did. And then, before long, the reaching begins again. This is not a reason for despair. It is simply the operating system. Understanding it does not eliminate the feeling, but it begins to locate it differently. The feeling of being behind may not be primarily a message about your life. It may be a message about the nature of wanting itself. And those are very different things. If the feeling were primarily about your life, then the remedy would be to change your life, to achieve more or faster or differently, to close the gap between where you are and where the imagined standard places you. But if the feeling is primarily about the structure of wanting, then closing the gap does not resolve anything, because the gap will simply reconstitute itself around new content. You will reach the marker, and the marker will have moved. The feeling will return because it was never primarily about the gap. It was about the way the mind relates to gaps in general. This is not the whole picture, but it is the beginning of a different kind of seeing. The feeling of being behind has, at its root, something to do with a mind that is always leaning forward, always measuring the distance between here and some imagined there. A mind that, by its very structure, makes it difficult to experience the present as sufficient. Not because the present is insufficient, but because the mind's default orientation is one of incompleteness, of not yet, of almost. And so when you lie down at night, when the forward motion of the day has stopped, and there is nothing to reach toward for the next few hours, the mind does not simply rest. It continues to measure. In the silence, it runs its assessments, checks its comparisons, notices the gaps. And the feeling arises, not from what you have or have not done, but from the mind doing what minds do in the absence of other occupation. This does not mean the feeling is meaningless. It means its meaning is different from what it appears to be. It is less a verdict on your life and more a reflection of the particular kind of consciousness that you and every other human being carries, a consciousness that is relentlessly comparative, relentlessly future-oriented, relentlessly aware of the distance between the actual and the possible, which is, in its way, remarkable. It is also exhausting. Both things are true, and both things are worth sitting with, quietly, without rushing toward resolution. There is another way to understand this feeling, one that does not replace Schopenhauer's observation, but deepens it. A philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard wrote extensively about what he called the weight of possibility. He was writing in the 19th century in Denmark, and his work was, in many ways, a sustained exploration of what it means to be a self, to have freedom, and to live with the awareness of that freedom. He was not a cheerful writer either, but he was extraordinarily precise about certain aspects of inner experience. And one of the things he was most precise about was the particular kind of anxiety that comes not from what has gone wrong, but from what could have been different. Kierkegaard understood that human beings are uniquely aware of themselves as having multiple possible lives. You are not simply the life you are living. You are also the lives you could have lived, the paths you did not take, the versions of yourself that were possible and did not become actual. This awareness is part of what makes human experience so rich and so difficult. Consider the sheer number of alternative lives you carry with you. There is the version of your life in which you made different choices at certain key junctures. The version in which you stayed, or left, or spoke, or remained silent. The version in which you pursued the thing you were drawn to, but did not trust, or trusted the thing you were drawn to, but did not pursue. The version in which you began earlier, or waited longer, or arrived at a different city in a different year, and met different people who led you somewhere entirely different from where you ended up. These alternative lives are not fantasies exactly. They are real possibilities that existed, in different forms, at different moments. They did not become actual. But they are not entirely gone either. They exist in the imagination as a kind of ongoing presence. And part of what the feeling of being behind is made of, Kierkegaard might say, is this: the weight of those unchosen lives pressing against the one you are actually living. You are not simply comparing your present to your past, or your present to some imagined future. You are also, at some level, comparing your actual life to all the possible lives that radiated outward from earlier moments of choice. The road not taken, to use a phrase that has perhaps been used so often it has lost its force, but underneath the familiar phrase is a real and persistent psychological phenomenon. The awareness that any path you take necessarily closes others, and that the others remain, in some form, as an alternative against which the chosen life is constantly, if quietly, measured. This is not the same as regret. Regret has a more specific shape. Regret says, I made the wrong choice, and the right choice was available to me, and I failed to take it. The feeling of being behind that we are exploring tonight is less specific than that. It is more diffuse. It does not necessarily point to a specific wrong turn. It is more like the general awareness that your life, as it has unfolded, is one version among many that were possible, and that other versions might have arrived somewhere that feels different from where you are now. Not necessarily better, in any clear sense, just different. And the difference itself carries a kind of weight. Kierkegaard spoke about anxiety as arising from the awareness of freedom. The person who knows they are free, who knows their life is not fixed, but genuinely open and contingent, cannot rest easily in that openness. The openness itself becomes a source of unease. Not because freedom is bad, but because freedom means that everything might have been otherwise, and the awareness of that otherwise is a form of vertigo. Think of it this way. If your life were entirely determined, if the path were fixed, and there were no alternatives, then the question of being behind would not arise. You would simply be where you are, because you could not have been anywhere else. The feeling requires the awareness of alternatives. It requires knowing, at some level, that other versions were possible, and that awareness is inseparable from the experience of being a being with choices, with agency, with a life that has unfolded through a series of genuinely open moments that could have gone differently. The feeling of being behind is, in this sense, a side effect of freedom. Not freedom in a grand, abstract sense, but the ordinary, everyday freedom of having made choices, having lived through moments of genuine openness, having arrived here through a path that was not the only path available. The feeling arises from the gap between the life actually lived and the life that the imagination projects as having been possible. And the imagination, given its nature, tends to make the unchosen paths look somewhat cleaner, somewhat more resolved, somewhat more arrived than the one you are on. This is worth noticing. The alternative lives you carry in imagination do not have the texture of actual lives. They do not have the small compromises and the unexpected difficulties and the slow accumulations of weariness that come with actually living something. They are imagined, which means they have a kind of ideal quality that actual life rarely has. The version of yourself that took the other path has not dealt with the specific frustrations and confusions that would have come with that path. It simply exists in your imagination as a possibility that might have been cleaner, clearer, more arrived. And your actual life, which you know from the inside, with all its texture and complication and unresolved quality, is compared to this clean imagined alternative, and found, perhaps, to be somehow less. But that comparison is not a fair one. The imagined life is always an abstraction. It does not have a lived interior. It does not have the quality of being experienced from the inside, with all the contradiction and mess and dailiness that comes with that. Your actual life, for all its unresolved quality, is at least real. It is the thing that is actually happening. The alternatives, however vivid they might feel in imagination, are not. And comparing the reality of what is to the ideal of what might have been is, in some sense, comparing incomparable things. This does not make the comparison easy to stop. The mind does not simply release these imagined alternatives because we point out that the comparison is unfair. Kierkegaard was not suggesting that the anxiety of freedom could be reasoned away. He was only identifying its source, which is something different from removing it. But understanding the source begins to change the relationship to the feeling. It is less a verdict on where you have arrived, and more a reflection of the particular kind of awareness that comes with having been free, with having lived through genuine choices, with being the kind of being that carries its own possibilities alongside its actualities. The feeling of being behind, seen through this lens, is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of possibility. It is what happens when a genuinely open life looks back at itself and sees all the ways it might have been different. That looking is painful sometimes, but it is also, in a strange way, a mark of the richness of the life being lived. A life with no sense of alternatives would have a different quality entirely. It would be flatter in some ways, less haunted perhaps, but also less alive to its own contingency, less aware of the genuine openness that makes a human life what it is. This is not to romanticize the feeling. There is no comfort in being told that your suffering is actually a sign of your depth. That is the kind of thing that sounds meaningful and lands as hollow. The point is not that the feeling is secretly good. The point is that it is not what it appears to be, not primarily a report on where you have failed to arrive. It is more like a structural feature of a life that has been genuinely lived, in genuine freedom, with the awareness that that freedom implies. And that, at least, is a different kind of thing to sit with. There is a third lens through which this feeling can be examined, and it comes from a very different kind of thinker. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, toward the end of the 19th century, about the problem of living in relation to external standards. He was fascinated by the question of where values come from, who sets them, and what happens when you live according to standards that are not genuinely your own. He was a provocative writer, often misread, frequently simplified into a kind of aggressive self-assertion that misses what he was actually exploring. What he was actually exploring, beneath the surface, was something quieter and more interesting. The question of what it means to measure yourself against something, and whether the measure you are using is actually yours. Here is the shape of his concern, laid gently out. Most of us, Nietzsche observed, do not invent our own standards. We inherit them. We absorb them from the culture we grew up in. from the expectations of our families, from the ambient assumptions of the society we move through. We learn, early and often, what a successful life looks like, what the markers of progress are, what it means to be on track. And we carry these standards with us, often without examining them, often without asking whether they actually reflect anything we value when we look clearly at what we value. The sense of being behind in this light is not just about the gap between where you are and where you feel you should be. It is about the question of who set the should. Where did the standard come from? Who decided what the pace of a proper life looks like, what a person of your age and circumstances ought to have achieved by now, what markers ought to have been reached? And is that standard actually yours? This is not an easy question to answer, because the standards we absorb from culture are not always visible to us as standards. They can feel like simply the way things are, the natural order of how a life unfolds. You finish school, you find work, you establish a household, you build toward certain recognizable forms of stability and achievement. These expectations can feel so ambient that they do not register as chosen. They feel more like gravity than like values. They simply apply, and you measure yourself against them, and find yourself ahead or behind, and feel the result. But they were not always there. They were not handed down from some neutral and universal authority. They were generated by a particular kind of society, at a particular moment in history, shaped by economic arrangements and cultural assumptions that have their own specific origins and their own particular biases about what a life is supposed to look like. And those assumptions may or may not have anything to do with what actually matters to you, with what actually constitutes a good and meaningful life by your own genuine reckoning. Nietzsche's suggestion was not that you should simply reject all external standards and live by pure self-determination. That reading misses him. His suggestion was more subtle, that before you allow a standard to judge you, you should at least examine whether it is a standard you actually endorse upon reflection, whether the should in your sense of should be further along is one that you, looking honestly at what you care about, actually believe. And when you ask that question directly, something interesting sometimes happens. The standards begin to lose a little of their solidity. Because when you look carefully at the specific things generating the feeling of being behind, they often turn out to be quite particular, quite culturally specific, quite contingent on assumptions that are neither universal nor obviously correct. The age at which you should have certain things settled, the particular form that professional achievement is supposed to take, the relationship structures that are supposed to mark a certain stage of life, the financial position that indicates you are on track. These are not eternal truths. They are historically specific, socially constructed benchmarks that vary considerably across cultures and across generations, and that have no more claim on being the correct measure of a life than any other set of standards. This does not mean they are entirely meaningless. Some of what we have absorbed from culture actually does align with genuine goods: stability, connection, meaningful work, contribution to something beyond oneself. These are not purely constructed values, but the specific forms they are supposed to take, the specific timelines they are supposed to follow, the specific appearances they are supposed to have. Those are far more contingent than they feel when the feeling of being behind arrives in the night. Nietzsche would ask, if he could sit with you now, whose voice is that? The one that says you are behind? Whose timeline is that? Who set the pace? And when? And on what authority? And have you ever actually agreed to it? Or has it simply been running in the background, measuring and judging, without ever having been invited in? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine ones. Because if you trace the feeling of being behind back to its source, back to the specific standard against which you are measuring yourself, you often find something that is less authoritative than it felt. A vague cultural norm, absorbed over years. An expectation from a family that had its own specific anxieties and its own specific ideas about what success looks like. A comparison to a particular peer or cohort whose life circumstances are different enough from yours that the comparison does not actually hold. The standard, when examined, turns out to be less like a law of nature and more like a habit of mind, a habit that was perhaps useful at some point, or that served some function, but that does not necessarily have an ongoing claim on how you understand your own life. Now, the feeling does not disappear simply because the standard has been questioned. Habits of mind are not dissolved by examination alone. But something shifts when you stop relating to the standard, as if it were simply true, as if it were simply the correct measure of where a life like yours should be. When you begin to hold it a little more lightly, a little more as a convention than as a fact, the weight of the verdict it delivers begins to feel less final. You are not behind by some cosmic reckoning. You may be behind according to a particular set of culturally specific, historically contingent benchmarks that you absorbed before you had the perspective to evaluate them. That is a different kind of thing. And a different kind of thing can be held differently. There is another thread to follow here, one that runs parallel to all of the above, and that, in some ways, underlies all of them. Seneca was a Roman philosopher, writing in the 1st century. He was a Stoic, though a Stoic of a distinctly humane and personal variety, and one of the things he wrote most compellingly about was time. Specifically, about the way that human beings tend to misunderstand their relationship to time, and about what that misunderstanding costs them. His most famous short work was called, roughly, On the Shortness of Life, and its central argument is one that has been quoted and discussed for 2,000 years. But at the core of it is something simple, something you can feel immediately when you hear it. Life is not short, Seneca said. We only make it so. The problem is not that we are given too little time. The problem is that we squander so much of what we are given. But Seneca's point goes deeper than the usual reading of it, which tends to flatten into simply, don't waste time, get on with things, carpe diem. That reading is too energetic for what he was actually saying. What he was actually pointing toward was something more structural. He noticed that human beings have a particular way of relating to time in which almost none of it is properly inhabited. The past is remembered either with longing or regret, or it is not thought of much at all. The future is anticipated with hope or anxiety, or it is dreaded or desired, but it is always somewhere ahead of where you are. And the present, the only time that is actually real, the only moment that is actually happening, is treated as a passage between past and future, as a corridor rather than a room. You pass through the present on your way to a future moment when things will be as they are supposed to be, when you will have arrived, when the feeling of being in motion will give way to a feeling of having settled. But that moment of arrival is always receding. You pass through the present toward a future that, when it becomes present, is also passed through toward another future. The present is never the destination. It is always the way toward a destination. And so, in a very real sense, you live very little of your life. You spend a great deal of it in transition, in preparation, in approach. You spend a great deal of it measuring the distance to where you intend to be, and not very much of it actually inhabiting where you are. And when you reach the end, Seneca suggests, what you find is not that you did not have enough time. You find that you did not occupy the time you had. You had been too busy traveling toward a life that was always just ahead. Now, this does not mean that the future does not matter, or that planning and anticipating are without value. Seneca was not advising a kind of formless presentism in which consequences are ignored and no thought is given to tomorrow. He was something more precise than that. He was noticing that the feeling of being behind, the specific ache of it, is inseparable from a relationship to time in which the present is always insufficient, in which now is always the place you are passing through on the way to where you need to be, and that this relationship to time is, in a certain sense, a choice, even if it does not feel like one. It is a habit of attention, a default orientation of the mind, which can be, at least partially, redirected. Not through effort or willpower, not through a decision to be more present, which tends to produce a kind of strained, performative attention that is even further from genuine presence than the ordinary wandering of the mind, but through something more like allowing the inquiry itself, the examination of the feeling and its sources, to gently loosen its grip. When you understand that the feeling of being behind depends on a relationship to time in which the present is always a corridor, something becomes available that was not available before. Not the ability to simply stop the feeling, but the ability to recognize it for what it is, to see it as a consequence of the mind's habitual orientation toward what is not yet here, rather than as a truthful report on where you have failed to arrive. Seneca also observed something that connects directly to the earlier threads of this reflection. He noticed that people spend an enormous amount of time and energy acquiring things, achieving things, reaching positions, and accumulating markers of success, but almost no time actually experiencing the life that those things are supposed to be producing. The achievement is oriented toward the experience of having achieved, but the experience of having achieved is itself immediately converted into a platform for the next achievement. And so, the actual richness of the life being lived, the specific texture of this day, this year, this period of your particular existence, is almost never the object of attention. It is only ever the background of attention, the place where you are while your attention is somewhere else. This is not a moral failing. It is an almost universal feature of how conscious life tends to operate, especially in cultures that are structured around progress and accumulation, and the constant measurement of position relative to where one ought to be. But it does mean that the feeling of being behind may be, in part, a consequence of looking at your life primarily through the lens of where it is going, rather than what it actually is. And that lens, while it has its uses, also produces a particular distortion. It makes every present moment look like evidence of not yet having arrived, rather than as the actual content of a life being lived. Let us stay with this question of comparison for a little longer, because it deserves more careful attention than it usually receives. The sense of being behind almost always involves an implicit reference to other people. Not necessarily people you know well, not necessarily people whose actual lives you have any detailed knowledge of. Often it is a kind of abstract cohort, a sense of where people like you, people of your age and background and circumstances, are supposed to be by now. And the feeling comes partly from sensing that this abstract cohort is, in some way, further along. This is worth examining closely. Because the information you have about where other people are is almost always incomplete and almost always selected in a particular direction. You know other people primarily from the outside, from what is visible, from what is presented. And what is presented is rarely the inner texture of their experience. It is the surface, the markers, the milestones, the achievements, the indicators of progress. And those indicators are curated, consciously or not, toward the more resolved aspects of a life. The messy, confused, uncertain interior does not tend to be on display. So you are comparing your interior experience, with all its uncertainty and confusion and sense of unresolved motion, to the exterior presentation of other lives, which is selected toward the appearance of arrival. And the comparison is not just unfair, it is structurally misleading. You are comparing one kind of thing to another kind of thing, and treating the result as if it were meaningful. The person whose life looks arrived from the outside is carrying their own version of this feeling, perhaps a different version, shaped by their particular circumstances and their particular relationship to their own standards and their own unchosen paths. But some version, because the feeling is not the exclusive property of people who have achieved less than their peers, or people who have made significant mistakes, or people who are genuinely behind by any reasonable metric. The feeling is remarkably egalitarian in its distribution. It visits people who, by most external measures, are doing extremely well. It visits people whose lives, from the outside, look enviably settled. It visits people who have achieved the specific things that the standard said would resolve the feeling, and found that the resolution did not arrive. Which is further evidence for the point that this feeling is not primarily about where you actually are. If it were about your objective position, it would be absent in people who had reached good positions, or at least significantly quieter. But it is not. It lives at least partly independent of circumstance, which means it is less a report on the facts and more a feature of the mind's orientation. And that is useful to know. When you look at someone whose life appears to have the quality of arrival that yours feels to lack, you are not seeing their experience. You are seeing a surface. Underneath that surface is a person who is also, in their quiet moments, measuring and comparing and finding, probably, some version of the same distance between where they are and where they imagined they would be. The content of that distance is different. The shape of the imagined destination is different. But the gap, the sense of not quite having arrived, the quiet background hum of being in motion toward something that has not yet resolved, that is likely to be there. This is not to diminish your experience by making it universal. The specific content of your version of this feeling is real and particular and yours. It is not simply the same as everyone else's. But the feeling itself, the structure of it, the basic shape of what it is to be a conscious being, measuring itself against its own imagined standard, that is widely shared, perhaps nearly universal. And knowing that does not solve anything, but it does shift the feeling slightly. It moves it from the territory of evidence about your specific inadequacy to the territory of something more general, something that belongs to the experience of being human in the particular way that humans are. And that shift, however subtle, is not nothing. There is something specific about the modern relationship to this feeling that is worth naming, because it intensifies the experience in ways that would not have been present in earlier periods of history or in other kinds of cultures. We live in a moment that is, by historical standards, extraordinarily saturated with other people's lives. Not the actual texture of those lives, not the daily, interior, complicated experience of being them, but the presentation of those lives, the images and markers and indicators of progress and achievement and arrival. Through every available surface, the lives of others are being projected, and those projected lives carry almost always a particular quality. They look finished, in some sense. They look like they have arrived somewhere. They look like evidence that arrival is possible, that the destination exists, that other people have found it while you remain in transit. This is a relatively new form of pressure. For most of human history, the range of lives you would have direct knowledge of was small. You knew your community, your neighbors, the people in your immediate circle. The comparison was limited to people whose actual lives you had some access to, some knowledge of the interior. And even within that limited comparison, the feeling of being behind was present, as it has always been. But it operated on a smaller scale, against a more realistic backdrop, with more information about the actual texture of the compared to lives. Now the comparison operates on a vastly larger scale, against a backdrop of thousands of carefully curated presentations of other people's progress, with almost no information about the actual interior of those lives. And the effect is a kind of ambient pressure that is difficult to locate and difficult to name, because it does not come from any single comparison, but from the accumulated weight of all of them, the constant low-level awareness that somewhere out there people are achieving and arriving and moving forward, and that the distance between their visible progress and your felt experience is significant. This is not an argument against the technology that produces this condition. That argument is made elsewhere by others, and it is a real argument. But tonight, that particular argument is less relevant than simply noticing the distortion it creates. The distortion is this: it makes the feeling of being behind feel more specific and more personal than it actually is. It makes it feel like a unique verdict on your particular life, when in fact it is, in part, a structural feature of living in a world where other people's lives are constantly visible in their most polished forms. Knowing this does not silence the feeling, but it provides a corrective to one of its most insidious qualities, the sense that everyone else has solved the problem that you are still struggling with, that the arrival you seek is something that other people have actually found, while you alone remain in transit. That is almost certainly not true. The arrivals you see are presentations. The interiors behind them are less resolved than they appear. It is worth being honest about something, now that several different frameworks have been offered for understanding this feeling. Philosophy is very good at providing perspective. It can stand at a remove from the feeling and describe its sources, its structure, its relationship to the deeper mechanics of human experience. It can offer lenses through which the feeling looks different than it did before. It can, over time, loosen the grip of the feeling by changing the relationship to it, by making it less a verdict and more an observation, less a conclusion and more an inquiry. But philosophy cannot make the feeling disappear, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. The feeling of being behind is real. Its sources in the structure of desire, in the awareness of possibility, in the inheritance of external standards, in the misalignment between present attention and present reality. These sources are real, and they do not evaporate simply because they have been identified. Understanding why you feel something is not the same as not feeling it. The map is not the territory, and a more accurate map of the feeling's origins does not transform the territory of the feeling itself. What philosophy can do, and this is not nothing, is change the quality of the experience. When you understand that the feeling comes partly from the structure of desire, rather than purely from your actual position, something in the relationship to the feeling shifts. It is a little less urgent, a little less conclusive. The verdict it delivers is less final, because you can see the source of the verdict and examine its authority. You can ask whether the judge that is sentencing you is actually qualified to do so. You can notice that the standard by which you are being measured was assembled from materials that were not yours, and that you have never formally endorsed it. None of this dissolves the feeling, but it changes what it means. And what something means is not a trivial matter. The same experience, understood differently, has a different quality. The same feeling, held with curiosity rather than with alarm, is a different experience than the same feeling held as a final word. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. Not to have solved anything, not to have reached a conclusion, but to have sat with the feeling long enough and carefully enough that it has begun to lose a little of its opacity, to have held it up to several different lights and seen it from several different angles, to have moved even a small amount from the experience of it as an obvious fact about your life to the experience of it as something more complex, more layered, more interesting, and less final. Return for a moment to the image of the horizon. You have probably had the experience of walking toward something in the middle distance, something that appeared to be clearly reachable. And as you walked, it remained at the same distance. The horizon does not approach. The middle distance does not close. You can walk for a very long time toward a point on the horizon and find that it remains perpetually at roughly the same distance ahead. The feeling of being behind has something of this quality. The standard against which you are measuring yourself, the point at which you would feel arrived, The condition under which the feeling would finally resolve tends to move in the same direction as your movement toward it. When you close the gap in one area, the standard accommodates, adjusts, locates a new gap. It is not a conspiracy or a failure of will or a character flaw. It is the natural motion of a mind that is oriented by its very structure toward what is not yet here. Schopenhauer described this with his pendulum. Kierkegaard named the anxiety of possibility. Nietzsche questioned whose horizon it actually is. Seneca pointed to the corridor-like quality of time when it is never inhabited as its own destination. Each of these is pointing at something slightly different, but they are all, in their way, circling the same truth. The feeling of being behind is not primarily a report on where you are. It is a consequence of how you relate to where you are. And that relationship, while it is deeply habitual and in many ways structurally built into conscious experience, is not entirely fixed. It can be loosened, at least partially, by understanding it. Not through effort, but through seeing. When you can see the horizon for what it is, a moving line rather than a fixed destination, the experience of walking toward it changes. Not because you stop walking, or because the horizon stops moving, but because you understand what you are doing. You are not failing to reach the horizon. You are walking through a landscape that contains a horizon, and the horizon is part of the landscape, not the end of it. Your life is not a journey toward an arrival point that you have so far failed to reach. Your life is the walking itself. The years you have lived are not evidence of delay. They are the thing. They are the actual content of the actual life, not the approach to a life that begins when certain conditions are met, not the preparation for a real life that starts when the feeling of being behind finally resolves. This is the life. These years, this period, this specific and unrepeatable configuration of circumstances and relationships and ongoing uncertainties. This is it. That statement can land in two very different ways, depending on the state of the person receiving it. If the life feels tolerable or good, it can land as a kind of relief, an invitation to inhabit the present more fully, a gentle reminder that the richness of what is actually happening is worth attending to, regardless of where it stands relative to some abstract standard. If the life feels genuinely difficult, genuinely wrong, genuinely in need of change, then the statement can feel like an unhelpful invitation to simply accept what should not be accepted. And that is a fair concern. This reflection is not, and has not been, an argument that everything is fine, that the feeling is without substance, that no changes need to be made, that the standard of a good and meaningful life is so relative that any life is as good as any other. It has not been making that argument. The philosophical perspective being offered here is not relativism. Some lives are, genuinely, better than others. Some situations genuinely call for change. Some standards, even if they were inherited from culture, turn out, upon examination, to actually reflect things you care about. Examining a standard does not necessarily lead to rejecting it. Sometimes examination leads to endorsement, to the recognition that this particular marker actually does track something real and important, and that the feeling of being behind it is, in this case, a genuine signal rather than a structural artifact. The inquiry matters. The philosophical work of this evening is not aimed at making you indifferent to your life, or at persuading you that nothing can be meaningfully evaluated. It is aimed at something more specific, at loosening the grip of the feeling long enough for you to look at it clearly, rather than through the distorting lens of urgency and alarm. When the feeling is less urgent, you can ask better questions about it. You can ask whether the standard you are not meeting is one you actually endorse. You can ask whether the gap you are feeling is one that genuinely calls for action, or one that is primarily a feature of the mind's tendency to locate gaps. You can ask whose voice is speaking when the verdict of being behind is delivered. You can ask what, if anything, the feeling is actually pointing toward. Those are useful questions, and they cannot be asked from within the feeling's own urgency. They require a small amount of distance, a slight loosening of the feeling's grip on the present moment, which is what this kind of slow, patient inquiry is for. There is something specific about nighttime that deserves attention here, because the feeling we have been exploring does not arrive with equal intensity at all hours. It has a particular affinity for the hours of darkness, for the time between the end of the day's activity and the beginning of sleep. This is not accidental. During the day, there is the structure of activity, the forward movement of tasks and obligations, and the social presence of other people. These things occupy the mind and provide it with a direction. The mind is pointed outward toward the things that need to be done, toward the conversations and the decisions and the small forward motions of the day. The feeling may be present underneath all of this, but it is not the foreground. It is in the background, waiting. When the day ends, when the activity stops, when the other people have gone or gone to sleep, the mind returns to itself. The distraction has closed, and what it was distracting from is still there, precisely where it was left. The feeling surfaces because the thing that was suppressing it has been removed. It was always there. The day's activity did not resolve it. It only occupied the space above it. This is why the night can feel, to some people, more honest than the day. Not more comfortable, not easier, but more honest. In the silence and the stillness, the things that are actually present in the mind become visible. The vague dissatisfaction that the day successfully covered becomes audible. The feeling of being behind, which was running quietly beneath the activity and the interaction, comes to the surface and announces itself. This can be experienced as the night being harder, as the nighttime mind being a crueler or more critical version of the daytime mind. But another reading is possible, that the night is not harder, but clearer, that the daytime mind is the one that is obscured, occupied with enough noise and forward motion that the deeper ruminations cannot surface, and that the night, by removing that noise, allows something closer to the actual state of the inner life to become present. If that reading has any validity, then the feeling that surfaces in the night is not a distortion. It is a signal. Not, perhaps, the specific signal it claims to be, not the straightforward verdict on your life that it presents itself as, but a signal of something real, of an inquiry the mind has been wanting to make, of a question that has been waiting for quiet, of a relationship between your inner life and the way you have been living that deserves attention. The night, in this reading, is not the place where things go wrong. It is the place where things become visible. And visible things however uncomfortable, are workable in ways that invisible things are not. There is one more angle worth exploring, and it is perhaps the most intimate. Running beneath all of the philosophical frameworks we have explored tonight is a more personal version of this feeling. The feeling of being behind is not just about external markers. It is not just about what you have or have not achieved by conventional standards, or about the comparison to a cohort of contemporaries. It is also, at a deeper level, about the gap between who you actually are and who you imagined you would become. This version of the feeling is perhaps the most difficult to name, because it requires acknowledging something that is uncomfortable to look at directly. Somewhere in the background of your self-understanding is an image of who you are going to be. Not in a grandiose sense, not necessarily a vision of great achievement or obvious exceptionalism, but a quieter image. Someone who had figured certain things out by now. Someone who had found a steadier relationship to their own life. Someone who had resolved certain confusions, arrived at certain clarities, developed certain qualities of character or understanding or ease that the self you actually are does not seem to fully possess. This imagined future self, this person you are going to become, is perhaps the most persistent source of the feeling of being behind. Because this comparison is not with anyone else. It is with yourself. Not as you were, but as you imagined you would become. And the gap between that imagined self and the actual self you are, with your actual confusions and uncertainties and ongoing unresolvedness, is one that no external achievement can close. Because it is not about what you have done. It is about who you are. And this is, perhaps, the core of it. All the other comparisons, with the achievements of others, with the markers of cultural success, with the imagined alternative paths, all of these are, in some sense, expressions of a more fundamental comparison between the person you are and the person you imagined yourself becoming. And that comparison has a particular quality, because the imagined future self was, by definition, someone who no longer felt the way you currently feel. Someone who had moved through this period of confusion and arrived somewhere more settled. Someone who no longer lay awake in the night, feeling behind. Which means that the feeling of being behind is, in part, a feeling of being behind your own imagined resolution, of not yet having become the person who has left this feeling behind. But here is what that framing conceals. The person you imagined becoming was invented by an earlier version of yourself, who knew less than you know now, who had less experience of how lives actually unfold, who was working from a more limited and more idealized sense of what becoming involves. The imagined future self was, in a certain sense, a naive construction, not worthless, not meaningless, but built from materials that were incomplete, built from the assumption that growth moves in a particular direction, toward particular kinds of resolution, toward a particular quality of settled clarity that may not actually be the way that growth feels from the inside. Because from the inside, growth often does not feel like arrival. It often feels like a deepening of complexity, a more nuanced and less simple relationship to questions that once seemed answerable, a richer and less resolved engagement with the actual texture of life. The person who has genuinely grown is often less certain than the person who imagined them, more comfortable with not knowing, more able to hold complexity without needing to resolve it, more present to the actual difficulty of things, rather than protected from that difficulty by the clean imagining of eventual resolution. You may be further along than you imagine, not in the direction you imagined going, but in a direction that is more complicated and more interesting, and ultimately more true to what growth actually looks like than the clean arrival of the imagined future self. The imagined future self was always a simplified version, a projected wish, and the actual self, with its ongoing uncertainty and its unresolved questions and its complicated relationship to its own progress, is more real than that, which is to say, more alive to the actual difficulty of being what it is, which is a thinking, feeling, uncertain, growing, unfinished person in the middle of their actual life. You are lying in the quiet. The room is what it is. The day is finished, and tomorrow is somewhere ahead, and the space between them is this particular moment, this particular quality of stillness. The feeling that you came to this reflection carrying, this quiet, persistent sense of being slightly behind, slightly misaligned, slightly not where you were supposed to be. That feeling has not disappeared. It would be dishonest to suggest it should have. Feelings of this kind do not respond to arguments. They respond to time and to patience and to the slow, repeated work of understanding. But perhaps the feeling is slightly different in quality than it was when you began. Perhaps it is held a little more loosely. Perhaps it is felt as something more complex and more interesting than a simple verdict. Perhaps it sits a little less heavily in the chest, not because it has been solved, but because it has been examined, turned over, held up to several different lights. Schopenhauer said, "The wanting does not stop, but understanding the wanting changes its relationship to you. You are not only your wanting, you are also the capacity to observe it." Kierkegaard said, "The weight of possibility is the price of freedom. To feel the weight of alternative lives is to be someone who had genuine alternatives. That is not a small thing." Nietzsche said, "Before you accept the verdict of the standard, ask whose standard it is. The measure that finds you lacking may not be a measure you actually endorse." Seneca said, "The life you are living is not the corridor. It is the thing itself. The moment you are in is not the approach to a future moment of arrival. It is the actual content of the actual life. And underneath all of these, something quieter. The person you are, with your specific confusion and your specific uncertainty and your specific ongoing unresolvedness, is not a lesser version of the person you were supposed to become. It is the person you actually are, which is more complicated and more real and more alive than any imagined future self could be. There is something in the night that knows this, something in the quiet, the stillness, the absence of the day's forward momentum, that has access to a different kind of knowing than the one that measures and compares and finds lacking. Something that simply perceives, without evaluation, the specific quality of this moment, this room, this particular configuration of being alive. That something is not always easy to reach. The measuring mind is faster, louder, more practiced. It has been doing its work for a long time, and it is very good at it. But in the slow, sustained quiet of a night like this one, in the gradual settling of thought toward something more like rest, it becomes possible to sense, at least briefly, a different relationship to where you are. not arrived, not resolved, not finished, but here, genuinely here, in a life that is, however imperfect and however different from what was imagined, actually being lived, with an interior that is, however confused and however uncertain, actually present and aware and still inquiring. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Consider the possibility that the condition of being unfinished is not a temporary state, a phase to be passed through on the way to the completed version of yourself. Consider that it is, instead, the permanent condition of a life that is genuinely being lived. Every life that is actually being lived is unfinished. Every person who is actually engaged with their own existence is in the middle of it, not at the end of it, not at the resolution of it. The feeling of being in process, of being not yet arrived, of being somewhere in the middle of something that has not resolved, is not a symptom of having fallen behind. It is a symptom of being alive. The completed versions, the finished selves, the lives that have fully arrived. These are not lives that are being lived. They are either lives that have ended or imaginary lives, projections and constructions, not actual ongoing experiences of actual ongoing people. The actual people, the ones who are genuinely engaged with their own existence, who are genuinely inquiring into the questions of how to live and what matters and who they are all, without exception, unfinished. They are all in the middle of something. They are all carrying some version of this feeling. They are all, to some degree, measuring the distance between where they are and where they imagined they would be, and finding the distance real. What distinguishes people is not who has finished and who has not. Nobody has finished. What distinguishes people is the relationship to being unfinished. Whether the unfinished quality of their life is experienced primarily as a failure, as a problem to be solved, as a deficit to be overcome, or whether it is experienced as the natural and permanent condition of a life that is actually happening, with all the richness and difficulty and uncertainty that life actually contains. Neither relationship is chosen in any simple sense. Both are, to some degree, inherited, absorbed, produced by the specific circumstances of a specific life. But they can be examined, and in the examining, they can, at least slightly, shift. You began tonight with a question. Why do you feel like you are falling behind, even when nothing is clearly wrong? It is not a question that has a single answer. It has, as we have explored, several overlapping answers, each offering a different angle on the same experience. The mind is structured toward forward orientation, toward the next thing, toward the gap between what is and what is imagined. That structure produces a persistent sense of not yet, which is felt as falling behind. The awareness of alternative lives, of the many possible versions of yourself that did not become actual, creates a comparison between your actual life and imagined ones. That comparison tends to favor the imagined, which have none of the texture and difficulty of the actual. The standards by which you are measuring yourself were, in many cases, absorbed from culture rather than chosen. They may or may not, upon examination, reflect what you actually care about. Their authority over you is not as solid as it feels. The relationship to time, in which the present is always a corridor toward a future arrival, means that the actual content of the life being lived is never quite inhabited as its own destination. the feeling of being in transit, is always present. And underneath all of this, the gap between the self you are and the self you imagined becoming, a gap that is real, but that may be measuring the wrong things. The actual self, with its ongoing complexity and its unresolved questions, may be further along a more honest path than the imagined self would suggest. None of these answers resolves the feeling, but together they change what the feeling is. They move it from the territory of obvious fact, from simply a report on where you have failed to arrive, to something more interesting, a consequence of the particular kind of consciousness that you carry, a feature of what it is to be human, specifically in this era, in this culture, with this particular mind and this particular life. That shift does not make the feeling comfortable, but it makes it less a verdict and more an inquiry, less a conclusion and more a question worth living with. And that is, perhaps, the best that philosophy can offer. Not resolution, but a different quality of relationship to the unresolved. Not arrival, but a changed experience of being in transit. Not the end of the feeling, but a slight loosening of its grip. Enough, perhaps, to let the night do what nights do, to let the mind relax its measurements and its comparisons and its assessments, and move slowly toward the simpler experience of being here, in this room, in this quiet, in this body, in this life that is actually happening. The question remains. But it is, perhaps, a more interesting question than it was when you began. Why do you feel behind, even when nothing is clearly wrong? Because the mind reaches forward. Because possibility has weight. Because the standards were absorbed before they were examined. Because time feels like a corridor when it does not have to. Because the imagined self was always a simplified version of the actual one. And because being behind, and knowing it, and lying in the quiet with that knowledge, is itself a form of honesty that requires a particular kind of courage. Not the loud, active courage of doing, the quieter courage of remaining with a feeling long enough to understand it. You have done that tonight, and the night will take it from here. The mind, when it has been given something to think about, does not always want to stop thinking. It holds on to the threads, turns them, follows them further. That is, in many ways, the mind doing what minds do, which is to say, the mind doing something genuinely good. But there is also a time for the thinking to soften, not to stop exactly, but to loosen its grip slightly, to let the ideas rest at the edge of attention rather than remaining at its center, to allow the intellectual engagement to give way to something quieter, something that is less thought and more awareness, less activity and more presence. This is not a command. The mind does not respond well to commands. It is more like an invitation. You have been holding this feeling tonight, this sense of being behind, in the company of several different ways of understanding it. Those understandings are not conclusions. They are perspectives. They will continue to be available, in different forms, at different moments, when the feeling returns, as it will return. Philosophy does not resolve the recurring questions of a life. It only makes them more interesting, more workable, more possible to inhabit without being overwhelmed by them. The night has reached a certain depth by now. The room is what it is. The quiet has its own particular quality, different from the quiet of earlier in the evening, softer, slower, with the character of something that is moving toward rest. You are not behind. You are exactly where someone who has lived your specific life, made your specific choices, carried your specific awareness, is at this specific point in time, which is to say, you are here, present, awake to the question, in the middle of something that has not finished, living a life that is genuinely being lived. That is sufficient, not as a consolation, not as a reframe, but as a simple description of what is actually true. The philosophers we have visited tonight, Schopenhauer in his dark clarity, Kierkegaard in his existential precision, Nietzsche in his questioning of inherited value, Seneca in his patient attention to time, none of them resolved this feeling either. They lived with versions of it. They thought about it carefully, wrote about it honestly, contributed their observations to the long conversation that human beings have been having with themselves about the difficulty of being alive. And the conversation continues. Through them, through you, through this particular night, through whatever the next days bring, the feeling will return, but it will return to a mind that has sat with it for a while tonight, that has turned it over and held it at different angles, that has given it a little more texture and a little less authority, and that is different from encountering it fresh and having it feel, again, like an obvious and final verdict. It is not an obvious and final verdict. It is a question, and you are, at least in part, the inquiry into that question, which is, as it happens, a very good thing to be. There is something that rarely gets named when people talk about the feeling of being behind, and it is this. The feeling is not built from large events. It is built from small ones. The large events, the clear failures and obvious wrong turns, are easier to identify and, in a strange way, easier to carry. They have weight, but the weight is proportionate to the thing. You know what you are holding. You can name it. A relationship that ended. A career path that did not unfold. A version of yourself that you invested in and then had to let go of. These things are real, and they are heavy, but they have a kind of integrity, a correspondence between the size of the event and the size of the feeling it produces. The feeling of being behind is built from something smaller, and because of its smallness, harder to account for. It is built from the accumulation of ordinary days, in which nothing obviously went wrong and nothing obviously went right, in which you moved through the hours and arrived at the evening without any clear sense of having made progress toward anything that matters. It is built from the slow drift of weeks that passed, without the thing you were waiting for arriving, without the clarity you were expecting to find, without the forward motion that was supposed to characterize this period of your life. It is built from the quiet weight of time that has been spent and cannot be recovered, not time that was wasted in any dramatic sense, but time that simply passed in the way time does, through the ordinary texture of a life being lived without ceremony. This is worth pausing on, because it identifies something important about the nature of the feeling. It is not primarily retrospective. It is not looking back at particular moments of failure and drawing conclusions from them. It is more like a sediment that has built up through ordinary living, layer by layer, almost imperceptibly, until the accumulated weight of it becomes noticeable. The feeling of being behind is, in many cases, the feeling of looking at the sum of your ordinary days and finding that the sum does not add up to the life you imagined you would be living by now. Not because any particular day was catastrophic, but because the days themselves were so quiet, so undramatic, so ordinary, that the gap between their texture and the texture of the imagined life widened almost without being noticed. This connects to something Seneca was pointing at, though from a slightly different angle. He observed that people tend to treat time as though it exists in unlimited supply, as though the particular day being lived is simply one of an indefinite number of similar days still ahead. And this assumption, which is in some sense necessary for the functioning of a life, because you cannot be fully present to the finitude of each day without being paralyzed by it, this assumption also produces a kind of chronic inattention to the specific day as it is being lived. The day is ordinary. There will be other days. The thing that matters will be attended to when it arrives. And so the day passes without the particular quality of presence that would allow it to feel like its own completed thing, rather than simply another increment in an ongoing transit toward somewhere else. And then, at some point, you look up. You notice the accumulation. You notice that a considerable number of those ordinary transitional days have passed, and that the somewhere else toward which they were all supposedly tending has not arrived. And the feeling that produces is familiar. The quiet, persisting sense that the life being lived and the life that was imagined have not converged in the way they were supposed to. But here is what this understanding adds. The problem is not that the days were wasted. The problem is that they were not inhabited as themselves. They were treated as passages, which means their specific content, the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon in a given month of a given year, the actual texture of what it was to be alive on that specific day, was not attended to as its own thing. It was only attended to as a means toward something else. And means, by definition, are not ends. They are not the thing itself. They are only the approach to the thing. Seneca was not arguing that you should abandon all orientation toward the future. He was arguing something more specific, that the habit of treating each present moment as primarily a corridor toward a future moment is a habit that quietly empties the life of its actual content, because the content is always now. The future, when it becomes now, will also be now, and if now is always only a passage, then the content of a life is always somewhere else, always just ahead, always not quite yet here. This is a different kind of loss than the loss of particular opportunities. It is the loss of the days themselves, not through dramatic waste, but through a habitual orientation that makes it structurally difficult to experience the present as sufficient, as real, as actually worth inhabiting with the full weight of your attention. The feeling of being behind is partly the accumulated awareness of this loss, not consciously registered in the moment, because in the moment you are busy, you are moving, you are managing the forward motion of a life, but registered eventually, when the motion stops long enough for the awareness to surface, the sense that something has been going by, something specific and irretrievable, and that you have been too occupied with arriving somewhere else to notice it going. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is a clarifying one. The mind keeps the feeling of being behind, but the body holds it, This is worth attending to, because most of the exploration tonight has been conceptual, has moved through ideas and frameworks and the structures of thought. But the feeling is not only in the thought, it is in the body as well, in the specific physical quality of lying in a quiet room, with this particular weight somewhere in the chest, or the stomach, or the throat. A heaviness that is not pain exactly, but is not neutral either. A kind of low-grade tension that persists beneath the level of explicit thought, and that does not resolve when the thinking resolves. You know this quality. It's not dramatic. It does not prevent sleep in the way acute anxiety does. It is more like a background condition, a slight alteration in the baseline quality of being in your own body, a persistent, mild unease that you have grown so accustomed to that you barely notice it until a quiet moment like this one makes it briefly visible. The body carries time differently from the mind. The mind thinks about time. It measures it, divides it into past and future, constructs narratives about it, places events in sequence, draws comparisons and conclusions. But the body does not think about time. The body is in time, which is a different relationship entirely. The body accumulates the years in a way that is not narrative but physical, in the way certain movements have changed, in the way certain kinds of tiredness are different from the tiredness of 10 years ago, in the way the face in the mirror carries the specific quality of the particular number of years that have passed, rather than the face you still half expect to see. The body keeps its own record, and it keeps it honestly, without the narrative adjustments that the mind makes to soften the record or reframe it or cast it in a more favorable light. And part of what the feeling of being behind is made of is this: the body's honest accounting meeting the mind's constructed narrative of where things ought to be. The body knows, in its way, how much time has passed. The mind knows, in its way, how much progress was supposed to have been made in that time. And the gap between what the body's honest record shows and what the mind's imagined timeline expected produces a feeling that is not purely conceptual. It is felt in the body as a form of weight. This is not an argument that the body is more trustworthy than the mind, or that the physical record is more real than the conceptual one. Both are partial. Both are limited. But attending to the body's role in the feeling changes the quality of the inquiry slightly. It grounds it. It reminds you that what you are sitting with is not only an abstraction, not only a philosophical problem to be solved by thinking more clearly. It is also a physical experience, a lived reality, and it deserves to be met with something that addresses the physical as well as the conceptual. What does it mean to meet it physically? It means, perhaps, to notice the specific quality of the body right now, the weight of the limbs, the rhythm of the breath, the way the surface supporting you feels against your back, the temperature of the room. These are not distractions from the inquiry. They are the ground of it. The feeling lives here, in the body, in the specific physical experience of being this person, in this room, at this point in time, and attending to the physical ground of the experience, without trying to fix or interpret what is found there, is itself a form of the same patient attention that the philosophical inquiry has been practicing all evening. The body will release the feeling in its own time and in its own way. not because the philosophical understanding has resolved something, but because the body, given enough quiet and enough stillness, tends toward rest. The tension in the chest is not permanent. The weight is not fixed. It will shift, as bodies do, as the night deepens and the thinking softens, and the particular conditions that intensify the feeling, the end of the day, the silence, the absence of distraction, gradually give way to the different conditions of sleep. This is not a solution, but it is a kind of patience, and patience with the body, with the specific physical reality of carrying this feeling on this particular night, is its own form of care. There is one thing that tends not to be counted in the accounting that produces the feeling of being behind, and it deserves to be named. The simple fact of continuing. Not continuing in any triumphant sense, not persisting through obstacles in a way that is narratively satisfying or obviously admirable, but the ordinary, unremarkable, largely unacknowledged fact of having gotten up on the ordinary days and moved through them, having managed the practical business of a life across the years, without any particular external recognition of the difficulty of that management. Having carried your specific version of this feeling, and the other feelings that come with being alive, through the days and years that brought you to this one. This is not a small thing, even though it tends to be treated as invisible. The cultural frameworks for measuring a life tend to be oriented toward achievement, toward the exceptional, toward what stands out from the background of the ordinary. The markers of success that generate the standard against which the feeling of being behind measures you are almost all markers of distinction, of having risen above some baseline, of having accomplished something that not everyone accomplishes. And so the baseline itself, the simple fact of having sustained a life across the years, of having continued to engage with the questions and the difficulties and the uncertainty of being alive, does not tend to register as an achievement. It is only the background against which achievements are supposed to occur, but it is not nothing. In fact, for many people, in many periods of a life, it is the primary thing that is actually being accomplished. The sustaining of a life through difficult years, the maintenance of some degree of integrity and care in relationships and work, the daily practice of continuing to try to live well even in the absence of clear signs that the trying is working. These are not minor accomplishments. They are, in their way, the substance of a life. They are what a life is made of, underneath and between the moments of obvious achievement. Marcus Aurelius, who governed the Roman Empire during a period of almost continuous crisis, and who wrote about the interior life with extraordinary precision, kept returning to a simple observation in his private notes, that the work of each day is sufficient for that day. Not grand, not exceptional, just sufficient. The doing of what is required with as much care and integrity as can be brought to it in the specific circumstances of the specific day. That was, for him, the actual content of a good life. Not the accumulation of notable achievements, but the daily practice of meeting what arrives with as much of yourself as you can bring. This perspective does not sit easily alongside the feeling of being behind, because the feeling of being behind is oriented precisely toward the accumulation of notable achievements, toward the markers and milestones that are supposed to indicate progress. But it offers something that is worth holding alongside that feeling. The suggestion that what is actually being measured in the quiet internal accounting of a life may not be the most important thing. That the quality of the daily practice, the care with which ordinary life is met, may matter more than the position reached on the external scale of achievement. That is not an argument against ambition, or against the desire to do particular things and reach particular places. It is only the observation that the standard by which the feeling of being behind measures you may be leaving out most of what your life actually contains. And a measure that leaves out most of what it is measuring is not a very accurate measure. There is a particular kind of knowledge that is available only at night, in the specific conditions of quiet and stillness and reduced distraction that nighttime provides. It is not a different kind of reasoning. It is not that the mind thinks more clearly at night than during the day, though for some people, in some respects, something like that is true. It is more that the night, by removing the demands and the forward motion and the social performance of the day, allows certain things to be known that were present all along but not visible through the noise. The feeling of being behind is one of these things. It was there during the day. It is always there, in some form, in the background. But the day provides enough occupation that it stays in the background. The night removes that occupation, and the feeling comes forward. But other things come forward too. In the same quiet that allows the feeling of being behind to become audible, other kinds of knowing also surface. The awareness of what you actually care about, which is sometimes different from what you pursue during the day. The sense of what genuinely matters in your life, which is sometimes obscured during the day by the urgency of what is immediately in front of you. The recognition of what is actually good in your circumstances, which the busy forward motion of the day tends to pass over without noticing. These things are also available in the night's quiet. They are not louder than the feeling of being behind necessarily, but they are present alongside it, if the attention is willing to rest on them. There is a philosopher in the Stoic tradition, Epictetus, who was born a slave, and who thought about freedom with a particular kind of seriousness that only someone who had experienced its absence could bring. He observed that most of what we spend our lives pursuing falls outside the category of what is actually in our power. External achievements, the recognition of others, the pace of our progress relative to some imagined standard. These are all, in his terms, not up to us. They depend on factors that we do not control, on circumstances and chance, and the decisions of others, and the particular shape that time takes as it moves through a life. And he was not interested in those things, not because they are unimportant, but because the pursuit of them, as though they were the primary measure of a life, tends to produce exactly the experience we have been sitting with tonight, the persistent, unresolvable sense of not having quite arrived. What is actually in our power, in Epictetus's terms, is narrower. It is our judgment, our attention, our orientation toward what happens rather than what happens itself. It is the quality of care we bring to the life we are actually living, as opposed to the life we imagined we would be living. And this narrower domain, which might seem like a consolation prize for people who failed to achieve the broader one, turns out, on examination, to be quite large. The quality of attention brought to an ordinary day is a real thing. The care brought to relationships, to work, to the practice of being the kind of person one wants to be, these are real and substantial. They may not register on the external scale that generates the feeling of being behind, but they constitute, in a very genuine sense, the interior life of a person. And the interior life is not nothing. It is, in many ways, the primary thing. The knight knows this, not by argument, but by the specific quality of what becomes available when the external measures and the forward motion and the social performance have all gone quiet. In that quiet, what tends to surface is not primarily the score on the external scale. What tends to surface is the quality of the interior, the particular texture of this person's experience of being alive, which is, in its way, irreplaceable and specific and real in a way that external achievements rarely are. There is a final distinction worth making, one that the feeling of being behind tends to collapse and that deserves to be carefully separated. There is the slowness that comes from avoidance, from the reluctance to begin things, or to finish them, or to commit to them fully. The slowness that comes from fear, or from the particular paralysis that can settle over a person when the stakes feel too high, when the possibility of failure feels more present than the possibility of success. This slowness is real, and it is worth attending to, because it can produce, over time, a gap between the life lived and the life imagined that is not entirely a structural feature of desire or possibility, but has something to do with choices that were made, or not made, in specific moments. And then there is a different slowness, the slowness that comes from taking things seriously, from not rushing through the stages of a life because the culture says they should be completed by a certain age, from allowing things to develop at the pace they actually develop rather than at the pace that would look best from the outside, from choosing depth over speed, or presence over productivity, or quality of attention over quantity of output. This slowness is not falling behind. It is a different relationship to time, one that the measuring instrument, the feeling of being behind, uses, is not calibrated to detect. These two things, the slowness of avoidance and the slowness of seriousness, can feel almost identical from the inside. Both produce a gap between where you are and where you could have been. Both generate the feeling of having fallen behind some imagined pace. Both show up the same way when measured against the cultural standard of what a life of a certain age and background ought to look like. But they are very different things, and collapsing them, treating all slowness as avoidance, all gaps as failures, all distances from the imagined standard as problems to be solved, is to misread the territory from the map. Part of what a serious intellectual life actually looks like is slow. Part of what genuine depth in relationships looks like is slow. Part of what it takes to understand something well, or to build something carefully, or to become, over time, the kind of person you actually want to be, rather than the kind of person it would be quickest to appear to be, is slow. And the culture that generates the standard against which you are measuring yourself does not tend to reward or even recognize this kind of slowness. It rewards the pace of visible achievement, the efficiency of milestone accumulation, the the rate at which markers of success are reached and converted into the next markers of success. But the interior life does not follow that pace, and a life oriented primarily toward the interior, toward the quality of experience and understanding and relationship rather than the accumulation of external markers, will always look, from the outside and from the perspective of the standard, like it is falling behind. Not because it is, but because it is moving through a different territory, at a different pace, according to a different logic. This does not mean that your slowness is necessarily the good kind. It is honest to acknowledge that. Some of it may be avoidance. Some of the gap between where you are and where you might have been may come from hesitation or fear, or the particular paralysis that certain kinds of people are prone to in certain periods of their lives. That is worth looking at, with the same patient honesty that this entire evening has been practicing, not as a verdict, but as an inquiry, not as a conclusion, but as a question. What, specifically, is the nature of this particular slowness? Is it avoidance? Or is it seriousness? Or is it something of both? And in what proportion? That question does not have an easy answer. But it is a more useful question than the one the feeling of being behind tends to ask, which is simply, why are you so far behind? The feeling collapses everything into a single verdict. The inquiry distinguishes, and distinction is, generally, a sign of more accurate understanding. The slowness of seriousness is not falling behind. It is moving at the pace that serious things actually require. And the feeling that this pace is insufficient, that it does not match the expected rate of visible progress, may say more about the inadequacy of the measuring instrument than about the inadequacy of the life. You are not the first person to lie in the quiet of a room at night with this feeling. This is worth remembering, not as a way of minimizing the feeling's particularity, not as a way of saying that your version of it is simply the same as everyone else's, and therefore unremarkable, but as a way of locating yourself within something larger than this specific night. You are participating in a conversation that has been ongoing for as long as people have been reflective enough to notice the gap between their actual lives and their imagined ones. That is a very long time. The ancients knew this feeling. They wrote about it in terms that are different from the terms available now, shaped by different cultural conditions and different frameworks for understanding what a good life looks like. But underneath those different terms is the same basic shape. The awareness of time passing, the sense of not having arrived, the comparison between the life lived and the life imagined, the particular quality of unease that comes with being a conscious being in the middle of an unfinished life. These are not modern inventions. They are features of the human condition that recur across every period of recorded human thought. Marcus Aurelius felt it. He wrote about it in the notes he kept for himself, notes that were never intended to be published, which makes them unusually honest. He returned again and again to the question of how to live well in the specific circumstances of the present, rather than in the imagined circumstances of some future in which things would be more resolved. He knew the pull of the imagined life. He knew the way the mind reaches forward and measures the distance. And he kept returning, patiently, to the practice of attending to the actual life, the actual day, the actual work, rather than the imagined ones. Montaigne felt it. He spent the latter part of his life sitting in a tower in the French countryside, reading and writing and thinking about what it means to be a human being, and he returned constantly to his own uncertainty, his own inconclusiveness, his own sense of being in the middle of something that had not resolved. His entire project as a writer was, in some sense, an extended meditation on what it means to live without having arrived, to be perpetually in the middle, to carry the unfinished quality of a life as its most honest characteristic, rather than as a deficiency. Chekhov felt it. He wrote about it in his stories, in the specific texture of ordinary Russian life that he rendered with such precision, in the characters who are always, in some sense, waiting for a life that feels more real than the one they are actually living, who sense the gap between the actual and the possible and cannot quite close it. The feeling is old. It is not a problem that your generation invented, or that the particular conditions of contemporary life created from nothing. Those conditions intensify it, shape it, give it specific content and specific cultural forms. But the underlying structure is ancient. It is part of what it has always meant to be a human being, with enough self-awareness to notice the distance between the life you are living and the life you imagined. And that long history is, in a quiet way, company. When you lie in the room tonight with this feeling, you are not alone with it in any final sense. You are in the company of everyone who has ever lain in a quiet room and felt the same basic quality of not yet, of slight misalignment, of gentle but persistent awareness of the gap. That company is not physically present, but it is real. The conversation has been long, and you are a part of it. Your version of this feeling, your specific relationship to this inquiry, your particular night with these particular thoughts, is your contribution to a conversation that began long before you and will continue long after. That is not nothing. That is, in its way, a form of belonging, not to a community of achievement, not to a cohort that has arrived somewhere together, but to the longer, quieter community of people who have taken their own unfinished quality seriously enough to sit with it, to think about it, to hold it in the way it deserves to be held, with patience, with honesty, without rushing toward a resolution that does not exist. Let the thoughts slow now, not by effort, just by allowing. The ideas do not need to be held tightly. They will be there tomorrow, in some form. They have been added to the texture of how you understand this feeling, and that texture remains, even in sleep, even in the forgetting. Understanding, once genuinely arrived at, does not fully disappear. The room is quiet. The day is over. Whatever the day was, it is finished, and what it was cannot be changed, and what tomorrow will be has not yet been determined. And here, in the middle, in the specifically unfinished middle of a life that is actually happening, there is simply this: the quiet, the breath, the gradual softening of attention. You are here. That is enough for tonight.